The rain had been falling on Cordale since before dawn, a thin grey rain that did not so much fall as hang in the air, and by the time the bell of the parish church had finished tolling its slow 9 notes for the burial of the Earl of Ashmere, the whole churchyard had gone the colour of pewter. The mourners stood in their black like a flock of wet crows along the gravel path, and the new grave waited open in the green turf, with the wreaths heaped wet and glistening beside it, and at the very edge of that open grave, a little apart from all the rest, knelt a young woman whom not one person in that grand and grieving company believed to be anything more than a hired mourner. She wore a plain black gown of cheap stuff, soaked through at the hem and at the knees where she had knelt down in the mud, and over her dark chestnut hair she had drawn a black shawl so worn that the rain came through it, and she wept. She wept quietly and steadily, with her gloved hands pressed to her mouth and her grey-green eyes fixed upon the coffin, and to the watching family of the dead Earl. That weeping was the most insolent and the most ridiculous thing they had seen all that long grey morning. For everyone in Corday knew, or believed they knew, the truth of her. She was a mute, a hired weeper, one of those poor creatures who go from funeral to funeral and sell their tears by the hour to families too proud or too cold to grieve aloud. The undertaker engaged them, paid them a shilling and their dinner, and stationed them about the grave, so that the procession should look properly stricken before the county. That, the family told one another, was all this girl could possibly be, and so they let themselves laugh at her, not loudly, for they were great people and knew how to be cruel in a whisper, but they laughed, and the laugh ran down the line of black-gloved hands and trembling jet earrings like a cold little wind. At the head of the grave, nearest the coffin, stood the dead Earl's mother, the Dowager Marchioness of Ravenstone, and it was she who set the tone of that laughter, as she set the tone of everything at Ashmere. She was a woman of perhaps 65 years, tall and rigidly erect, of spare, commanding build, with a long, high cheekboned face, a sharp aquiline nose, and thin lips pressed into a permanent line of disdain. Her skin was pale and papery and finely lined. Her eyes were a hooded pale ice blue that seemed to look down at the whole world even when they looked level, and her silver white hair was dressed high off her forehead beneath a great black bonnet hung with a long black crepe veil and a single jet aigrette that quivered when she moved her head. She wore the heaviest and most expensive mourning that money could buy, black bombazine and black crepe and black Whitby jet at her throat and at her wrists, and she carried it as a queen carries a crown, as a thing owed to her by the world. And she looked at the weeping girl in the cheap-soaked gown, and she let her thin mouth curve, and she said, in a voice pitched exactly loud enough to carry, that it was a wonder what the undertakers would scrape up these days, and that she supposed one got what one paid for, even in grief. The family rippled with amusement. There was the dead Earl's younger brother, the Honourable Crispin Vale, a sleek and handsome man of perhaps 40, with oiled dark hair, and a soft, plump white face, and small, clever eyes, who stood with his black-gloved hands folded over the silver head of his cane, and smiled the smile of a man who has already begun, in his mind, to spend a great deal of money. There was his wife, a thin, brittle woman in black silk with a long pointed nose and a great deal of jet, who held a black-edged handkerchief to a face that had not shed a single tear. There were cousins and connections and hangers-on, 24 of them, all in their borrowed grief, and one and all they looked at the kneeling girl and found her absurd, found her presumptuous, found in her cheap honest weeping a thing to be despised. For who, after all, was she? They did not know her name. They had never seen her face before that morning. She had simply appeared at the light gate before the procession formed, a slight, upright young woman of about 23, of medium height, with a slender build and a long, graceful neck held very straight, a pale ivory complexion gone whiter still with cold and grief, a delicate oval face with a softly pointed chin and a calm level brow now crumpled with sorrow. Large grey-green eyes wide set and steady and now swimming in red, and dark chestnut brown hair drawn back plainly beneath her worn black shawl. She had asked the sexton, very low, where she might stand. And the sexton, who was a kind old man, had told her she might stand wherever her heart bade her, and so she had gone, of all the places in that great churchyard, to the very edge of the grave. And there she had sunk down into the mud as though her legs would no longer hold her, and there she had wept as though her own heart were going down into the ground inside that polished coffin. Which, though not one soul among the great mourners guessed it, was exactly the case. For the slight weeping girl in the cheap black gown was not a hired mourner at all. She was Wren, and she was the lawful wedded wife of the man they were burying, married to him quietly and truly 2 years before in a little stone chapel far to the north, where no one of his grand and grasping family had ever thought to look. She was the Countess of Ashmere, and the great house behind them on the hill, Ashmere Hall, with its long avenue of limes and its 100 windows and its rent rolls and its farms and its woods, every stone of it and every acre, belonged by the plain, unbreakable law of the land, not to the dowager, not to the smiling brother with his cane, not to any of the black-clad mockers ranged about the grave, but to her, to the girl kneeling in the mud whom they had hired, as they imagined, for a shilling. She knew it. She had the proof of it folded against her heart, beneath the cheap-soaked black gown, where no one could see. And she did not say a word. She let them laugh. She knelt in the cold mud at the edge of her husband's grave, and she let the rain come through her worn shawl, and she wept for the only person in all that great country who had ever called her by her name and meant it as a blessing, and she let his proud, cold family stand over her and mock her, because grief, true grief, has no pride left in it to wound, and because she had promised him, in the last quiet days when the fever had him, that she would not fight them across his open grave. She had promised. "Bury me first," he had said, his thin hand in hers. "Let them have their day. And then, my Wren, when the earth is closed and the laughing is done, then you will stand up, and you will go up to the house that is yours, and you will be what you are. But not before. Not over me. Let me go down into the ground in peace." And so she wept, and she waited, and the rain fell, and the great people laughed, and not one of them knew that the wheel had already begun, very slowly and very surely, to turn. To understand how a barefoot weaver's daughter from a northern dale came to be the lawful Countess of Ashmere, and to be kneeling unknown in the mud at her own husband's grave, you must go back 3 years to a time before any of these grand mourners had ever heard her name. Wren had been born in the high cold country where the mills run on the becks and the wind never quite stops, the daughter of a weaver who died of his lungs when she was 14, and after that she had kept herself and her small brother by spinning and by mending, and by such honest work as a clever pair of hands can find. She had a gift with herbs and with the sick that the village wives trusted, and so when word came up the dale that a great gentleman from the south had been thrown from his horse on the moor road and lay near death at the old coaching inn with no one to nurse him, it was Wren whom the innkeeper's wife sent for. She did not know he was an earl. He did not tell her. He lay in the narrow inn bed with his leg broken and a fever rising, a tall man of perhaps 35, with a lean, grave face, dark hair greying at the temples, deep-set dark eyes and the long, fingered hands of a man who had never done a hard day's labor in his life, and he watched her, through the long nights of the fever, set bones and brew her bitter teas and cool his forehead. And he did not once tell her that the muddy traveller she was nursing owned half a county 200 miles to the south. He called himself only Mr. Ash, and in the 3 weeks that it took the fever to break and the leg to begin to knit, 2 things happened that neither of them had looked for. The first was that he came to know her, truly to know her, in the way that only sickness and long quiet nights allow, and found in her a steadiness, a wit, a deep, unfrightened kindness that all the gilded drawing rooms of the South had never once shown him. And the second was that she came to know him, the man beneath the fine coat and the careful manners, and found him lonely, far lonelier than any poor man she had ever met. A man hemmed about all his life by a mother who measured love in acres and a brother who measured it in what could be got. A man who had been told from the cradle exactly whom he must marry and what he must want and who he must be, until he scarcely knew any longer whether there was a real man inside the title at all. He told her things in the dark that he had never told a living soul. And when at last the leg was mended and he could walk, and the day came when he must go, he did not go. He sat in the inn parlour with his hat in his hands like a boy, and he told her, at last, who he was. He told her the whole of it, the title and the great house and the rent rolls and the mother, and he watched her face change, watched her draw back from him, and he understood why. For a wise poor girl knows better than to love a great lord. She knows that such a love brings her nothing but ruin, and a broken heart, and the contempt of his people. And so Wren had said to him, very steadily, though it cost her, that he must go home to his own kind, and forget the moor and the inn and the weaver's daughter who had nursed him, and marry the great lady his mother had chosen, and be happy if he could. And the Earl of Ashmere had looked at her for a long moment, and then he had said the words that changed both their lives. He said that he had spent 35 years being what other people required, and that he was tired to the very bone, and that for the first time in all his life he had met a person who looked at him and saw a man and not a fortune, and that he could not, give that up to go back into the cold and live as a dead man in a fine coat for the rest of his days. He asked her to marry him, not as a great lord conferring a favour, but as a tired and honest man asking the only person who had ever made him feel alive. And Wren, who was wise, said no. She said no 3 times over 3 days for all the wise good reasons. And on the 4th day, when she understood at last that he meant it, that he would rather have her in a cottage than the whole of Ashmere without her, she said, yes. They were married quietly in the little grey stone chapel at the head of the dale by a curate who asked no questions, with the innkeeper and his wife for their only witnesses. And the lines were entered fair in the register and signed and sealed, all lawful, all binding, all true. And the Earl knew his family. He knew that if he brought her south to Ashmere as his countess, his mother would make her life a daily torment, would scorn her and freeze her and work without ceasing to break the marriage and drive her out. So he did a thing that was either very wise or very foolish, and that would, in the end, prove to be the saving of everything. He kept the marriage secret. He told no one in the South. He went home alone and played the bachelor Earl, and he settled upon Wren by a deed drawn up secret and tight by a London lawyer who could be trusted, a quiet income that kept her and her brother in comfort in a snug house in a market town where no one knew her, and there, 3 or 4 times a year, on whatever pretext he could invent, he came to her. And there for 2 years they had what neither of them had ever expected to have in this life, which was a true marriage, a real and tender and laughing happiness, hidden away in the green folds of the north like a secret kept by God himself. He gave her the great Ashmere signet, not to wear but to keep, sealed in a box, against the day it would be needed. He had his London lawyer, old Mr. Pelham, lodge a true copy of the marriage lines and the settlement, and a fresh will in a strongbox in Lincoln's Inn, sworn and witnessed. And he told her every time he came the same grave, loving thing, that the law was on her side, that the truth was on her side, and that if anything should ever happen to him, she was to go to Pelham, and to no one else, and Pelham would see her righted. She had never thought she would need it. He was a strong man, and not old. But the more that had brought them together took him in the end, in its own way, for it was on the long cold ride south after their last parting that he took the chill that settled on his chest and would not lift, and within the month the fever had him. And within 2 months the great proud doctors of the south had given him up, and Wren, summoned too late by a frightened note in his own failing hand, had come south at last in her cheap black travelling gown, and had been refused at the door of her own house by a footman who did not know her, and had sat instead in the parlour of the village inn at Cordale and waited, and had heard the great bell begin to toll, and had known, before any messenger came, that he was gone. When the parson had read the last words, and the first wet earth had been thrown down upon the coffin with that sound that no living heart ever forgets, the great mourners turned from the grave, and began to move back along the gravel path toward the line of black carriages. And as they went they did not trouble to lower their voices, for the rain was loud, and the hired weeper was beneath their notice. And so Wren, kneeling still in the mud, heard the whole of what they meant to do. She heard the Dowager Marchioness say, in her cold carrying voice, that the funeral baked meats might as well be cleared by tomorrow noon, for there was no sense in feeding the parish, and that the household was to be cut by half before the month was out, the old pensioners turned off first, the ones her son had been so weakly fond of keeping on. She heard the Honourable Crispin Vale answer in his soft, pleased voice that he had already written to the agent and to the London Bank, and that he supposed the entail would see the title and the bulk of the estate come to him now, as the next male heir, his brother having died, as everyone knew, a bachelor with no son. She heard the Dowager say that of course it would, that there had never been any question of it, that Ashmere had passed from man to man of their blood for 300 years and would go on doing so, and that the only mercy in her son's foolish, soft-hearted life was that he had at least had the decency to die without saddling them all with some grasping wife and a nursery full of squalling claimants. And at that the whole family laughed again, comfortably, the laugh of people who have just inherited a great deal and have already, in their minds, divided it up. They spoke of which rooms should be redone, of the pictures that might be sold, of the old retainers who must go, of the village school the late Earl had founded and paid for out of his own pocket, which Crispin observed with a chuckle was a sentimental extravagance he should certainly close. They spoke of him, the man not yet covered in his grave, as one speaks of a tiresome relation who has at last had the good manners to die, and they walked away through the rain pleased with the world and with themselves, and behind them, unregarded. The weeping girl in the cheap black gown lifted her white face from her hands and watched them go, and her grey-green eyes, which had been so full of helpless tears, had begun, very slowly, to dry. She did not move for a long time after the carriages had gone. She knelt on at the graveside in the falling rain until the 2 sextons came with their spades to fill the grave in earnest, and the kind old one, recognizing the hired weeper, told her gently that she had earned her shilling and might go and get herself warm. And Wren rose, stiff with cold, and thanked him, and stood looking down at the brown wet earth that now lay over the man she had loved. And she said to him, under her breath, where no one could hear, that she had done as he asked, that she had let them have their day, and that now, with his leave, she would do the rest. Then she drew her worn shawl about her and walked out through the light gate into the village, and the rain fell on the new grave behind her, and the great house waited on the hill. She did not go up to the hall that night. She was wiser than that. She knew that a poor woman in a cheap black gown who walked up to the door of Ashmere and announced that she was the Countess would be laughed off the step at best, and at worst handed over to the parish constable as a madwoman or a swindler, and that the family, once warned, would have every reason and every means to bury the truth as deep as they had buried her husband. The strong have 100 ways to crush an inconvenient truth when they see it coming. No, she would not give them the warning. She went instead to the little inn at Cordale where she had lodged, and she paid for one more night out of the few coins she had left, and she sat up by the small fire in her cold room drying her one good gown, and she took out, from where it lay against her heart, the thing she had carried south. It was a packet of oiled silk, and within it, dry and safe, were 3 things. The first was a letter in the late Earl's own hand, written to old Mr. Pelham, his London lawyer, instructing him to render to the bearer every assistance, and to act in all things upon her word. The second was the great Ashmere signet ring, heavy old gold, graven deep with the raven crest of the house, which her husband had pressed into her hand at the last and bidden her keep until the day she should need it. And the third, folded small and worn soft at the creases with much reading, was a certified copy, sworn and sealed, of the entry in the marriage register of the little grey chapel at the head of the dale, where her name and his stood, written side by side, lawful and true and beyond any power on earth to unwrite. She looked at these 3 things for a long while by the firelight. Then she wrapped them again in their oiled silk and put them away, and she lay down. And she did not weep any more, for the time of weeping was past, and she slept, and in the morning she rose and put on her one good gown, and she set out, not for Ashmere on the hill, but for the London road, for she was going first to Mr. Pelham. The chambers of Mr. Pelham stood in a quiet court of Lincoln's Inn, up a worn stone stair behind a low black door, and when Wren was shown into them, weary and travel stained from the long coach journey, the old lawyer rose from behind his great cluttered desk and looked at her over his spectacles for a long moment before he spoke. He was a small, dry, precise man of 70, with a bold, freckled head and shrewd, kindly eyes and ink-stained fingers, and he had served the late Earl and the Earl's father before him for the better part of 50 years, and he was, Wren would come to learn, one of the very few people in the whole of her husband's grand cold world who had loved him for himself. When she had told him who she was, and laid before him on the green leather of his desk the letter and the signet and the certified copy of the marriage lines, the old man sat down, rather suddenly, and took off his spectacles, and wiped them, and put them on again, and read the documents through twice in perfect silence. And then he did a thing that astonished her. He rose, and he came round the desk, and he took her cold hand in both of his dry old ones, and he bowed over it, very low, as a man bows to a great lady, and he said, in a voice gone thick, that he had the honour to be the most obedient servant of the Countess of Ashmere, and that his late dear master had written to him not 3 weeks before his death to say that if anything befell him, a lady would come, and that Pelham was to spend the last drop of his old blood, if need be, in seeing her righted. For, the old lawyer told her, her husband had not left things to chance. There was lodged in the strong room of that very building, sealed and witnessed and proved beyond any cavil, the original of the marriage settlement, the original marriage lines, and, most precious of all, a will, drawn fresh and signed but 8 months past, in which the late Earl of Ashmere, being of sound mind, devised every part of his great estate that was free of the entail, which was to say the vast bulk of the money, the London house, the unentailed lands bought in his own lifetime, and above all the great hall of Ashmere itself, which his careful grandfather had broken out of the entail 2 generations before, to his beloved wife Wren, Countess of Ashmere, absolutely and forever. The title, the bare title of Earl, would indeed pass under the old entail to the next male heir, to the smiling Crispin, let him have the empty name and welcome. But the house, the land, the money, the power, the whole substance and body of the inheritance that the family imagined was already theirs, was hers, was Wren's, devised to her by her husband's own hand in a will that the law would uphold to the last comma. The grasping family, in their haste and their certainty, had reckoned on a bachelor dying without a will, leaving all to fall their way by the simple working of blood. They had reckoned without the quiet weaver's daughter, and without the dry old man in the dusty chambers who held, in his iron-strong room, the proof that would undo them all. But Mr. Pelham was a careful lawyer, and he did not let her ride north in triumph the very next day. He warned her, gravely, that the family would not yield to a piece of paper, however good, that they would fight, that they would call her an impostor and the marriage a fraud and the will a forgery, that they had already, he had no doubt, taken physical possession of the hall and would hold it by main force and bluster while their own lawyers were set on to bury her claim under a mountain of delay. The strong, he said, never fear the law in the abstract. They fear only the law made plain before witnesses, in a place where they cannot lie their way past it. And so he laid before her a plan, a lawyer's careful patient plan, and Wren listened, and agreed, and put herself wholly in his old and faithful hands. While Pelham set the proper machinery turning in London, the proving of the will, the entering of the claim, the quiet engaging of the great names of the law who could not be overawed by a marchioness, Wren herself would go north. But not as a claimant hammering at the gate. She would go quietly, into the village of Cordale and the world below stairs at Ashmere, and she would learn the lie of the land, and she would find the old true servants whom her husband had loved and who had loved him, and she would wait, patient as the turning year, until the day came that Pelham would name. The day of the great reading and the great proving, when she would walk into the house that was hers before the whole assembled county and be revealed. Let the family heap up their cruelty and their greed in the meantime, the old lawyer said, with a dry, cold gleam in his eye. Let them turn off the old pensioners and close the school and sell the pictures and toast their good fortune in the late Earl's own wine. Every act of it would be a stone in the wall that would fall on them at the last. So Wren went north again. And she did a thing that none of the proud family would ever have dreamed of. A thing only a woman who had been poor all her life would have thought to do. She did not go to the front of the great house. She went to the back. She went, in her plain gown, to the housekeeper's room at Ashmere, and asked for honest work. And because she was clearly respectable and clever and spoke gently and asked little, and because the household, gutted by the family's economies, was short-handed and overworked, she was taken on with scarcely a question as an underservant, a still-room maid to help with the preserving and the simples and the sick nursing of the few old pensioners not yet turned off. And so the Countess of Ashmere came home to her own great house at last, not through the carved front door beneath the raven crest, but up the worn back stair with an apron tied over her gown and a basket of herbs on her arm, to live unknown beneath the roof that was hers by law, among the servants who would one day be her own, and to watch, with her steady grey-green eyes, the people who had laughed at her graveside make ready, all unknowing, the rod for their own backs. The weeks that followed taught Wren her own house from the bottom up, and taught her too a great deal about the people who had laughed at her in the rain. She learned the back stairs and the still room and the long cold passages, and she learned the hearts of the people who kept them. Chief among the old servants was the house steward, a tall, spare, upright old man of nearly 70 named Mr. Goodwin, who had been born on the estate and served it all his life, and grieved for the late Earl as for a son, and who went about now with a grey-stricken face, watching the new masters strip and sell and turn off, and powerless to stop any of it. There was the old cook, Mrs. Tarn, broad and red-armed and kind, who wept into her pastry over the pensioners being turned out into the winter. There was a lame stable boy, and 2 ancient gardeners, and a blind old harper who had played in the hall on feast nights for 40 years, all of them marked down on the Honourable Crispin's neat list to be turned off without a character and without a penny, because, as he said, sentiment was a luxury the estate could no longer afford. And there was one other whom Wren marked particularly, a grave, watchful young footman of about 25 named Jonas, tall, lean and straight-backed, with a broad, high, noble brow and a strong, straight nose, a sober, honest, weather-touched face, steady, dark, hazel eyes, a firm, controlled mouth, and dark brown hair cut short and severe in the servant's fashion. Jonas had come to the house only a year before, taken on by the late Earl himself off the road, and he wore the great house's bottle-green livery with its scarlet cuffs and silver-crested buttons, and he did his work in a deep, watchful silence, and Wren noticed that of all the servants he alone never spoke ill of the dead master, nor flattered the new ones, but went his way with a kind of banked and waiting steadiness, as though he too were biding his time for something. She did not yet know his secret, and he did not know hers, but 2 watching souls in a house full of the careless and the cruel will find each other out, and a quiet friendship grew between the new still-room maid and the silent footman, built of small kindnesses and the things that did not need to be said. Meanwhile, the family made merry. The Dowager Marchioness had installed herself in the best apartments and ruled the house with a rod of iron, finding fault, cutting wages, and entertaining the county in the late Earl's Hall as though no death had ever darkened it. The Honourable Crispin, who now styled himself the Earl of Ashmere and signed himself so with a flourish in every letter, gave himself up to the pleasures of a great fortune he had not earned. He ordered new horses, new clothes, a new equipage. He had the late Earl's beloved books carried up to the lumber room to make space for a billiard table. He gambled deep with the loud young men he brought down from London and lost, and made it good out of moneys he ordered the agent to wring from the tenants, raising rents in a hard winter on families that had farmed the same fields for generations. And every cruelty, every economy, every callous, careless act of the new masters, Wren saw and remembered, and quietly, where she could, undid. When the old pensioners were turned out, it was the still-room maid who carried them food and found them shelter in the village out of the small purse Pelham had sent her. When the village school was closed and locked and the schoolmistress dismissed, it was Wren who gathered the children of an evening in the cottage of one of the turned-off gardeners and taught them their letters herself by rushlight, as her own dead husband had wished them taught, when a tenant family was driven to despair by the new rent. It was a quiet, anonymous gift left on their windowsill that saved them from the road. The village did not know who their secret friend was. They knew only that since the good old Earl had died and the hard new ones had come, some unseen hand moved among them, doing the kindnesses that the master would have done, and they blessed that hand without a name to put to it, and the blessing went up like a slow tide all through the dale, and gathered, all unknowing, about the head of the still-room maid. And all the while the great machinery in London turned. Letters passed in secret between Wren and old Pelham, carried by a trusted carrier who thought he bore only a servant girl's harmless correspondence. The will was entered for probate. The family's lawyers, scenting at last that some claim was stirring, began to bluster and to delay, but Pelham, dry and patient and immovable, met every move, and built his case stone by careful stone, and named at last the day. There was to be a great gathering at Ashmere Hall, a formal reading of the late Earl's affairs before the assembled family and the chief tenants and the magistrates of the county, a thing the family themselves had demanded, certain it would set the seal of law upon their possession and silence forever the vague rumours of some northern marriage that had begun. They knew not how to creep about the county. They meant it for their coronation. Pelham meant it for their judgment. And so the trap, baited by the proud with their own greed and sprung by the patient hand of the law, was set for a grey afternoon in the great hall of Ashmere, beneath the carved raven crest, before the eyes of all the country that had laughed. In the last days before the appointed reading, the cruelty of the great house reached its height, as such cruelty always does just before its fall. The Dowager Marchioness, restless and imperious, took it into her head one evening to inspect the still-room and the stores, and there she came upon the new maid, Wren, at her work among the drying herbs. Something in the girl's quiet composure, in the steady, level look of her grey-green eyes, in the way she did not cringe, offended the old woman to the very soul, for tyrants cannot bear a servant who is not afraid. She found fault with everything. She declared the preserves ill-made and the linen ill-kept, though both were better done than they had been in years. And she ended by accusing the girl, on no evidence at all, of pilfering candles and sugar for her own use, and she summoned the steward, old Mr. Goodwin, and ordered, in her cold carrying voice, that the insolent creature be turned off in the morning without her wages and without a character. And Wren stood through it all, with her hands folded and her head up, and said not one word in her own defence. For she knew, as the raging old woman did not, that within the week the whole order of that house would be turned upside down, and that the woman now sentencing the maid to the road would shortly be standing on the very same spot to receive a far heavier sentence from a far higher court. She only looked at the dowager, steadily, and the steadiness of that look enraged the old woman further, so that she raised her ebony cane as if she would have struck the girl across the face. And it was then that the young footman Jonas, who had come in silently with the candles and seen the whole scene, stepped forward out of the shadows and placed himself, without a word, between the upraised cane and the maid. It was a small thing, the smallest gesture of a servant's body, but it was done with such grave, unhurried steadiness that the old Marchioness checked and stared and lowered her cane and demanded furiously to know what he meant by it. And Jonas said, very quietly, that the maid had wronged no one, and that he would not stand by and see her struck. The dowager, white with affront, ordered him turned off too, that very night, and swept out in a rustle of black silk. And in the quiet that followed, in the small warm light of the still room, the footman and the maid looked at one another, two people who had each just risked everything for the other, and something passed between them. Wren thanked him, low, and asked why he had done it, why he should ruin himself for a still-room maid he barely knew. And Jonas was silent a long moment, and then he told her his secret, the thing she had sensed in him from the first. He told her that he was not what he seemed. He told her that he had come to Ashmere a year before, not as a chance footman off the road, but searching for the proof of his own birth, for he had been raised a foundling in the south by a poor curate, with nothing of his own in all the world but an old gold ring on a worn leather cord about his neck, a ring graven with a raven crest, and a single dying word from the woman who had reared him, that his mother had been a gentlewoman wronged by the great house of Ashmere, and that the ring was his only proof of who he truly was. He had come to find the truth of himself, and instead he had found a house of greed and cruelty, and a master, the late Earl, who alone of all the blood had been kind to him, who had taken him on and watched him with a strange searching tenderness, as though he half guessed something, and who had died before he could speak whatever it was he meant to say. And Wren, hearing this, looking at the grave, honest, weather-touched face, at the broad, noble brow so like and yet unlike her dead husband's, felt her heart turn over. For she remembered now a thing the Earl had said to her once, low and grieving, of a old family wrong, a child of his own dead elder brother, born out of wedlock and cast off by the proud dowager, and lost, a boy who should by every law of God, if not of man, have had a place at Ashmere, and whom the family had hidden away and let vanish to keep the name unspotted. She did not yet know it for certain, but she drew from her bodice, that night, the great Ashmere signet she carried, and held it in the candlelight beside the worn old ring on the cord at the young man's throat, and the two ravens, graven by the same hand 22 years apart, looked at one another and were the same. The footman was no chance comer. He was the late Earl's own nephew, the lost cast-off heir of the elder line, with as true a drop of Ashmere blood in him as any that had ever laughed in that hall. And so, on the eve of the great reckoning, in the warm hush of the still room, the two outcasts of Ashmere, the unknown countess and the lost heir footman, joined their hands and their secrets, and resolved to stand together when the day came, and to see justice done not for themselves alone, but for every soul the great house had wronged. The day of the great reading came clear and cold, and all the county came with it. The carriages rolled up the long avenue of limes from noon, and the great hall of Ashmere, hung now in the family's heavy mourning, filled with the rank and fashion of 3 shires, the magistrates in their sober black, the clergymen, the great landowners and their wives, the chief tenants standing awkward at the back in their Sunday coats, all gathered to see the affairs of the late Earl set in order and the new master confirmed in his glory. The Honourable Crispin, who called himself Earl now, sat enthroned in the great carved chair upon the dais at the head of the hall, splendid in new black. His soft white face shining with satisfaction, his small clever eyes moving over the assembled county as a man counts his possessions. Beside him sat the Dowager Marchioness, rigid and erect, magnificent and terrible in her black bombazine and her cold jet, her hooded ice-blue eyes sweeping the hall with imperial disdain, her thin mouth set in its line of judgment, certain, wholly certain, that this was the hour of her family's triumph. The servants stood ranged along the panelled walls in their livery, as they had been bidden, to swell the show, and among them, unregarded, stood a slight upright young woman in a plain dove-grey gown, her dark chestnut hair drawn into a low coiled knot, her grey-green eyes steady and quiet, and beside her a grave young footman in bottle-green livery, very straight and still, No one looked at them twice. At the foot of the dais, at a small table, sat a small, dry, precise old man in a rusty black coat, with a bald, freckled head and ink-stained fingers and shrewd, kindly eyes, who had arrived that morning from London with a black tin box and a clerk, and whom the family's own lawyers greeted with the wary politeness due to a famous and dangerous name. This was Mr. Pelham. The Honourable Crispin had been told only that the late Earl's confidential man would attend to read the dispositions and settle all in form, and he had graciously permitted it, for it suited his vanity to have the thing done with full legal pomp before the county. He did not know what was in the black tin box. Mr. Pelham rose, and the great hall fell silent, and the old lawyer, in his thin, dry, carrying voice, said that before he read the late Earl's last will and testament, the company should understand one fact upon which all the rest depended, and that fact was that the late Earl of Ashmere had not died, as had been supposed, a bachelor. He had died a married man. A rustle went through the hall like wind through corn. The dowager's head came up. Crispin half rose from his chair. Pelham went on, unhurried, implacable, and laid upon the table, one after another, his proofs, the certified marriage lines, sworn and sealed, of the late Earl and his lawful wife. Married 3 years since in the chapel at the head of Wensdale before witnesses yet living, the deed of settlement, and last, drawn fresh and signed but 8 months before his death, before unimpeachable witnesses, the late Earl's true will, devising the entire unentailed estate, the great hall of Ashmere itself, and all its lands and moneys, to his beloved wife, the Countess of Ashmere. Absolutely and forever. The hall erupted. The family's lawyers were on their feet, shouting fraud, forgery, imposture, demanding to know where this so-called countess was, if she existed at all, challenging her to show her face. The Dowager Marchioness rose from her chair, white and shaking with fury, and cried out in her cold, ringing voice that it was a lie, a vile northern swindle, that her son had been entrapped or the papers forged, and that she would see the whole pack of conspirators in gaol before she would yield 1 stone of Ashmere to some scheming nobody, some kitchen wench, some hired creature dragged out of the gutter to play a part. And it was upon that word, upon the word creature, that the slight young woman in the plain grey gown stepped quietly out from among the servants along the wall, and walked, unhurried and erect, down the whole length of the great hall, through the parting astonished crowd, to the foot of the dais, and turned, and faced them all. And old Pelham said, in a voice that rang now to the carved rafters, that the company need seek no further, for the Countess of Ashmere stood before them. There was a silence such as the old hall had never held. The dowager stared down at the grey-gowned girl, and the colour drained from her papery face, for she knew her. She knew the steady grey-green eyes, the calm, level brow. It was the still-room maid she had ordered turned off for pilfering candles. It was, though her reeling mind could scarcely hold the two together, the hired mourner who had wept at the graveside in the rain, the cheap creature she had mocked, the nobody, the nothing. And the nothing stood before her now, quiet and unbroken, and into the ringing silence Wren spoke, for the first time, clearly, so that every soul in that hall might hear. She said that she was indeed that weeping woman from the graveside, and that very still-room maid, and that she had stood among them unknown these many weeks, and seen all that they had done, the old pensioners turned out to die, the school locked up, the tenants ground, the dead man mocked across his open grave. She said she had let them do it, every cruelty, because her husband with his dying breath had asked her to let them have their day. Their day, she said, was over. She drew from her bodice the great Ashmere signet, the raven seal, and held it up, and the oldest tenants in the hall, who had seen that ring on the late Earl's hand all their lives, drew breath and bowed their grey heads. For they knew it, and their knowing was worth more than all the lawyer's parchment. And the magistrates of the county, grave men who could not be bought nor overawed, came forward and examined the seals and the signatures and the witnesses, and one by one, before the whole assembly, they pronounced the documents good, the marriage true, the will valid, and the lady's claim proven beyond any doubt of law. But the world was not done delivering its judgment upon the proud, for the truth, once it begins to fall, falls all at once. As the magistrates pronounced, old Pelham lifted his hand and said there was one matter more, a matter not of inheritance, but of plain law, and he called forward the estate agent, a sweating, uneasy man, and laid before the magistrates the account books of the year just past. And there, written in the agent's own hand, at the new master's own order, stood the record of his stewardship, the rents wrung from the tenants in a hard winter and squandered at the gaming table, the pensions stopped, the moneys of the estate, which until probate were not yet lawfully his at all, taken and spent and gambled as though they had been his own. The Honourable Crispin had not waited for the law to make him master. He had simply seized and spent, and the agent, pressed now before the magistrates, and in terror for his own neck, confessed that he had been ordered to falsify the rolls and conceal the worst of it. It was no longer a question merely of who should have Ashmere. It was a question of moneys taken that were never his, of tenants defrauded, of an estate plundered under colour of an inheritance that had never existed. The magistrates' faces grew very grave. The great county families, who an hour before had bowed and smiled to the Honourable Crispin, drew back from him now along the panelled walls as men draw back from something unclean. And his loud London friends were suddenly nowhere to be seen, and his thin, brittle wife, with her jet and her dry eyes, had gone the colour of ash. He who had styled himself Earl of Ashmere sat collapsed and grey in the great carved chair that was not his, and stammered, and could not meet the eyes of the room, and the soft white satisfaction had run out of his face, and left it slack and old. Then Pelham turned to the Dowager Marchioness, and his dry old voice grew, for the first time, almost gentle, which was the most terrible thing of all. He said that there was a last document the late Earl had charged him to read out before the family, in the presence of witnesses, on this day, above all days. And he read a letter in the dead Earl's own hand, written in the last month of his life, in which that grave and gentle man spoke from beyond the grave to his mother. He wrote that he had spent his whole life trying to earn a love from her that was only ever given for what he could add to the name, and that he had found at last, in a poor weaver's daughter on a northern moor, the thing his mother had never once given him, which was to be loved for himself alone. He forgave her, he wrote, he forgave her freely, and with his whole heart, the coldness and the schemes and the loveless measuring of all his days, but he charged her, by whatever she held holy, to look upon his wife and learn, before it was too late, what she had thrown away. And he set down, plainly, the old buried wrong of the house. The child of his elder brother, born and cast off and hidden away to keep the name unspotted, his own true nephew, and by the law of blood the rightful heir of the elder line, and he laid it upon his mother's conscience before all the world. As the old lawyer read, the Dowager Marchioness stood frozen, and the imperial disdain that had armoured her whole life cracked and fell away. And for the first time in the memory of any soul there she looked, simply like a very old woman who has understood, too late, the full measure of what she has done. And then the grave young footman in the bottle green livery stepped forward from the wall beside his countess and drew from beneath his collar the worn leather cord and the old gold ring graven with the raven, and held it up beside the great seal in Wren's hand, and the two ravens matched, and the oldest servants gasped. And Mr. Goodwin the steward cried out, his old voice breaking, that he knew that ring, that he had seen it on the hand of the dowager's own elder son a quarter-century gone, and that here, by the living God, stood his son come home. The dowager looked upon the face of the grandson she had cast away into the dark as an infant to keep her precious name clean, the lost child grown now into a grave honest man, wearing her own livery as a servant in the house that should have been his. And something in her broke that had been hard for 70 years, and she sat down very suddenly and covered her face with her ringed old hands, and wept, and they were the first true tears that proud woman had shed in the memory of any living creature. So the wheel came full round, and the world delivered its judgment, not with fire, but with truth, which is heavier. The law took its course in the days that followed. The moneys fraudulently taken were ordered to be repaid out of the Honourable Crispin's own private fortune, which beggared him, stripped of the estate he had thought his own and shamed before the whole county. He and his brittle wife left Ashmere in a hired chaise before the week was out, and went abroad to live small and obscure on what little remained. And the county, which had laughed with him, did not trouble to write. He kept the bare empty title, for the law of the entail gave it him, and Wren would not stoop to contest a name. But a title without an acre or a shilling or a friend is the thinnest of cloaks against a cold wind, and he wore it out his days in lodgings on the continent, a forgotten man. And now comes the part of the story that the proud never understand, and the gentle always do. For when all the power of Ashmere lay at last in the small, steady hands of the weaver's daughter, she did not use it as they would have used it. She might have turned the old dowager out into the winter as that old woman had turned out the pensioners. No one in the county would have blamed her. But Wren remembered her husband's letter and his forgiveness, and she would not let the great wrong of that house be answered by another. She went to the broken old woman, alone, and she raised her up, and she told her, quietly, that she might live out her days in the dower house at the edge of the park, in comfort and in peace, for she had been her husband's mother, and that was enough. The dowager, who had armoured herself all her life against love because she had never learned to bear it, wept again and took the girl's hand and called her, in a whisper, daughter, and in the few years left to her she became, slowly and painfully, something gentler than she had ever been, softened at the last by the very mercy she had never shown. And the lost heir, the grave young footman, Wren would not see cheated of his blood a second time. With Pelham's help she searched out the truth of his birth and established it at law, and though the bare title had gone to the disgraced Crispin and could not be recalled, she settled upon her husband's true nephew a great portion of the estate and a fair house upon it, and made him in all but name the master of the Ashmere lands, and the two of them, the Countess and the lost heir steward, ruled the great inheritance together for the good of every soul upon it. The old pensioners were brought home, and their pensions restored and doubled. The school was opened again, and a new wing built to it, and named, at Wren's wish, not for herself, but for her husband. The hard new rents were rolled back, and the tenants who had been ground almost to the road found their burdens lifted, and their old friend in the great house revealed at last to be no anonymous hand, but their own true mistress. Old Mr. Goodwin the steward lived on in honour to a great age. Mrs. Tarn ruled her kitchen in plenty. the blind harper played again on feast nights in the hall. And on the anniversary of the day they had laughed at the hired mourner in the rain, Wren, Countess of Ashmere, walked down through the lime avenue to the quiet churchyard, alone, and knelt at her husband's grave, no longer in cheap soaked black, but in the soft grey she had always loved, and laid upon the green turf a single sprig of moorland heather brought down from the high dale where he had found her. And she told him, lo, that she had done all that he had asked. She had let them have their day, and then she had stood up, and she had been what she was, and she had answered their cruelty not with cruelty, but with the slow, patient justice and the deep mercy that he had taught her, and the house was at peace, and the wronged were righted, and the proud were humbled, and the cast-off had come home. The rain that had wept over his burial did not fall that day. The sun lay warm and gold upon the old grey stones, and the heather glowed against the green, and somewhere up the dale a lark was singing. And if you had stood that bright, still morning at the edge of the churchyard and watched the slight, upright woman kneeling at the grave, you would never have guessed that she was the greatest lady in 3 shires, the mistress of all those acres and all those windows on the hill. You would have seen only a young woman in a plain grey gown, with grief and peace together in her steady grey-green eyes, keeping faith, as she had kept it through rain and mockery and the long patient dark, with the one good man who had ever looked at the world and seen, where everyone else saw a poor nobody to be laughed at, the truth of who she was. And that, in the end, is the whole of the story and the only lesson worth the telling, that the world may laugh at the one who weeps in the rain, and the proud may divide the spoils across an open grave, but truth has a long memory and a longer reach, and what is buried in patience is raised in glory, and the meek and the faithful who keep their promises in silence and answer cruelty with mercy are lifted up at the last into the high seat, from which the proud are cast down, and given, beyond all their hoping, their own true name and their own true home. And peace.